Welcome to this new chapter of In Conversation With. This event that we host at CIDOB and allow us to discuss current affairs with distinguished experts. Today, I welcome Samantha Gross. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Samantha is Director on the Energy Security and Climate Initiative and Fellow in Foreign Policy at Brookings institution. Samantha has more than 25 years of experience in energy and environmental affairs. Thanks, Samantha, for being here with us today.
My pleasure, and thanks for inviting me.
So my first question for you is about the extraordinary last year we had in the energy landscape. As you mentioned in a recent article, although oil and gas prices have come down from the highest points and energy issues have faded somewhat from the news, the effects of the war in Ukraine on energy will continue and evolve in 2023. So what's your forecast for this year in terms of prices and energy security globally? Could you say Europe is already out of the woods?
Sadly, I don't think that Europe is out of the woods, especially with respect to gas supply. I'm as pleased as anybody that Europe got through the winter as well as it did this past winter. But the challenge upcoming is that there's really no new LNG, liquefied natural gas, coming online to the market this year. But we're seeing China recover from its COVID problems. And so we're likely to see no new supply, but increased demand for liquefied natural gas, which was a really important factor in getting Europe through the winter, keeping the lights on, keeping homes and businesses warm. And so I think there's the potential for a more difficult winter this time than the last because of tighter supply. On the oil side, that looks tight too, unfortunately. 10 days or so ago, as we record this, the OPEC Plus group announced that they were going to reduce production quotas. And this was a bit of a surprise, given that the market is looking tighter, given that China is coming back. And the International Energy Agency just announced that they think that oil demand is growing and that supplies are going to be tight by the end of this year. And so both sides of the equation, both oil and gas, look like they're tight for the rest of 2023.
That sounds hard. So do you see that we will need in Europe more need to do a reduction in demand for the next winter?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to continue the demand reductions that you've been working on. And I mean, some of those things are structural, like people putting heat pumps in their homes, for instance, instead of natural gas heating. And some of those were more like demand destruction, shutting down some industrial production. The former is a lot better than the latter, but I think Europe is going to need to continue these programs into the coming winter and also hope for warm weather, as happened last year.
Oh. So, a side effect of the drastic European reduction pipeline imports from Russian natural gas in the last year has been increasing of imports in liquefied natural gas, the reopening of coal-fired power plants, and new push for nuclear power globally. So, in a context where energy security has become a top priority again, how do you see the energy mix in the future, in the near term or in the middle term, as you want to frame the question?
Yeah, so energy security has been getting more attention recently for obvious reasons. But in my opinion, energy security really never left the scene. I think of the balancing of energy supply as being kind of a three-legged stool, with those three legs being affordability, sustainability, and security. And you need to keep those three factors in balance to have a reasonable energy supply. I don't think today's crisis has changed where we're going over the long term towards a zero carbon energy system that's more based on electricity. This might have changed the pathway a little bit. It might have changed the speed of travel, but ultimately the direction that we're going hasn't changed at all. This is just a bump in the road rather than a total change in direction.
Okay. And do you see like new risk in this accelerated pathway, like we're increasing so rapidly and trying to increase so rapidly renewables, or for instance, when I think in nuclear, we were surprised last year with the severity of the droughts in Europe, and we discovered how important it is for the rivers to be in the appropriate temperature. So what can we expect this year or next year? So what will we surprised about?
You know, I think next year and in the one following that are going to look a lot like the past year in terms of supply. I can't speak to the weather; I'm not that good, but I think the thing that the current crisis has really done is something that was likely to happen anyway. And that is, I think many of us wanted to think that the supply of fossil fuels was sort of a given while we did the transition, and that we didn't have to worry about that so much, that we could focus on the transition and that today's fuels would take care of themselves. And the situation with Russian gas supply in Europe has really reminded us that that situation doesn't take care of itself either, and that you have to pay attention to the fuels that we need during the transition as we're transitioning. It's unfortunate and adds a layer of difficulty, but that was going to happen anyway and was true the whole time. I think that this situation just really brought that to the fore.
So does it mean that in terms of prices, we should expect again a rise in energy prices in the short term? What would you expect for the next winter and even the summer if there's
I mean, exactly. I mean, it depends somewhat on demand in other places and also to a large extent on the weather. But yeah, I think you can expect to see natural gas prices especially go up again, and oil prices as well. Hopefully not quite as much as they did around this time last year and during last summer when there was just a real panic. A lot of gas supply was gone. Europe was really worried about getting its storage filled. You're in a better position now. Storage is still partly full after the winter. And so I don't think you'll see those panicked price rises, but I think you're likely to see higher prices than you see now, unfortunately.
I hope you're right, because I'm feeling some complacency here. We were partially lucky and we didn't have so many problems in the last winter. Most of the problems are falling behind. So if there's a repricing of expectation and prices, then the change could be very, very, very sudden.
Yeah, it's not time for complacency just yet.
So in the last year, we have seen many governments, especially in Europe and in the US, promoting large renewable programs such as the Inflation Reduction Act or the REPowerEU and the European Union to reduce energy dependence on Russia, gain strategic autonomy in the framework of the strategic competition with China, and to accelerate the reduction on greenhouse gas emission. So my question is, are these efforts enough to achieve these decarbonization goals? And if so, what are the main obstacles you see?
Yeah, I mean, we've gained a lot of understanding over the past year that energy security is like yet another reason for the transition. And it's really great that these two things aren't at odds with each other, that they're actually pushing in the same direction. That's really helpful. Here in the US, especially, the politics sometimes doesn't quite work that way, but really they are both arguing for a transition away from fossil fuels. You know, the main obstacles with respect to our decarbonization goals right now, I think, are just the sheer size and speed of what we're trying to do. This is a multi-trillion-dollar global system that underpins the entire economy. And so just the sheer amount of investment and building and all these things that we're trying to do, it's a massive undertaking. And we don't just need scientists and new technology in order to do this. We need tradespeople. We need electricians and plumbers and machinists. We need to deal with the permitting and siting of all these projects. There's just so much to do. And so I'm really happy to see all the programs that both the US and the EU have put in place. But we need to keep in mind the enormous scale and the amount of stuff that we need to build a whole new energy system, and remember what a challenge that is.
So will you position yourself in the optimistic side of catching up with China in this new clean technology, or you think we should take a more conservative approach given the labor constraints and all the change that is needed in terms of investment and the economic landscape? So how optimistic are you in this framework?
You know, I'm optimistic that the West will meet their climate goals. I'm cautiously optimistic that the West will meet its climate goals, I should say. And as far as a race with China, we can talk about that a little more later, but we have to remember that we don't want to play China's game. We're not going to beat China if we play by China's rules. We need to think about what it is that we're good at in our own economies and focus there. So like the United States or Europe are not suddenly going to become the low-cost producers of solar panels, for instance, but we can focus on what it is that we're really good at, our dynamic economies, the the investment environments and the innovation and startup environments. And those are the things that are going to help us reach our goals rather than trying to be more like China.
And what about the implication for the European Union? Because in the EU, we have seen that there's very good aspects of the new regulation in the new law in the United States, but at the same time, we are a little bit worried about the competition effects, of this new law in a fair competition, in both sides of the Atlantic. So, how do you see the impacts of the IRA in geopolitical terms? How do you see this relation going?
Yeah, and I think understanding how the IRA came about requires a little bit of understanding about where the US is politically. There's no appetite here for EU-style climate regulation that is more focused on a carbon price and also more focused on regulation and more sticks rather than carrots. We just can't get that done politically here. And so we got the kind of bill that we were going to get in our current political environment. One really focused on subsidies, because those are a lot easier to get done than regulation and sticks. And then also the protectionism in the bill comes from the US obsession with competition with China. One of the very few things that both parties in my country can agree on is that we're obsessed with China. We're concerned with China's role in the world and with our ability to compete with it. And so China bashing is what got us here, frankly. The administration is working on some of the things that are in the bill that have proven to be problematic to our European friends, to our friends in Asia, and trying to find ways to have sort of limited free trade talks that can allow those companies to be included in some of the IRA subsidies. But this is the way it was going to be. If we were going to do climate policy seriously, it was going to look like this. And so we're kind of stuck with the size and shape of the IRA as is.
And do you think that this competition with China in clean technologies speed up or hinder the fight against climate change?
You have to think about sort of how we go about this. And I think that could go one of two directions. If we try to play China's game by China's rules, I think that slows down the transition. If the United States, for instance, decides that it wants to have really strong local content regulations on solar panels, for instance, that's going to make the transition slower and more expensive because China has such a clear lead in producing that technology at low cost. However, we need to play at what we're good at. We are good at encouraging new technologies, at taking technologies from the laboratory to the pilot stage to commercialization. Here in the United States, we're particularly good at working in the subsurface. We have a big oil and gas industry where we sort of understand and are comfortable with working underground, which is really helpful for things like carbon capture and sequestration. We need to focus on what it is that we're good at and not get so protectionist that we're trying to exclude Chinese technologies at the expense of going faster and cheaper. It's a really, really difficult trade-off. And I think certainly the politics in my country, and I think yours as well, are still trying to figure this out.
Yeah, my concern is that when you look in a very broad perspective, this new regulation, they don't distinguish between the old renewables and then these new technologies in which Europe and the US can have leverage. For instance, when you see solar panels or you see some technologies in which the Chinese have a very large advantage, it's very clear that we are not going to catch up. Because, as you mentioned, the costs are overwhelming. But even in new technologies like hydrogen, where they have some advantages, at least in terms of cost. I'm a little concerned that if we protect ourselves, no, like there's a protectionist way in these new legislations, the cost of climate transition will increase, and then it will slow down the fight against climate change. So I don't know if in terms of cost, we are going to this place where you say that in this new technology, we are exploiting our advantages, and we are letting China compete in their part.
Yeah, I mean, solar panels is kind of an extreme example in which China has such a head start. I don't think we'll catch up. Other technologies are different. Batteries and critical minerals are a good example. I get asked all the time whether the world is basically trading its dependence on petrostates for oil and gas to a dependence on China for critical minerals, going from one set of authoritative regimes to another. And I disagree with that. I think they're fundamentally different products. A fuel that you need to run the system is quite different from materials to build the new system. But still, we are going to need so many of these materials that there is room in the market for everybody. You see a lot of focus in the IRA here in the US to develop new critical minerals and to batteries and electric vehicles in particular to have those critical minerals as part of our production. But oh my gosh, we need not just the fancy, cobalt and rare earths and all the things we talk about, but really simple things like copper. If we're going to electrify the world, like copper is the mineral of electrification, and we're going to need a whole lot more of it. And so China does have an advantage in these markets now, but there is so much room for expansion that I think that it doesn't necessarily have to stay that way. In fact, I don't think it can stay that way because we need so much more supply. And a lot of these minerals are reasonably widely distributed. Rare earth minerals are kind of misnamed. They're not that rare. They are around, we can mine them other places. And so I think we need to focus on that rather than being like, oh, China has the advantage now and it's always going to be that way. I think in certain industries, that's not necessarily the case and can't stay that way if we're to get the world adequately supplied.
And so, okay, you have these critical minerals that is more or less widely distributed. But when you look at processing and refining, there you have a big weight of China in those processes, maybe because it's very costly in terms of environment. So do you think there's a chance of some of these processes going back, reshoring to, or nearshoring to Western countries?
Yes, and I don't think it's necessarily returning production. I think it's additional production because we need so much. So it's less reshoring and more entirely new capacity coming in countries that are closer by. I also hope that as the US and Europe really focus on increasing the supply of all these materials that we're going to need, everything from rare earths to more pedestrian things like copper, that we really focus on the standards in producing them. I think a lot of folks want to think that the energy transition is a return to Mother Nature and a free lunch and necessarily more environmentally friendly than where we started. But we have to remember that we're still going to be in an extractive world. An industrial size energy system is going to do industrial things. And this need for all this new capacity is really an opportunity to think about how to do it well, how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from those processes, how to really think about reducing the local pollution levels and to do everything we can to do this new capacity well. And so I think it's an opportunity. And given that we need the capacity, it needs to happen.
Let me ask you now, talking about new technologies and renewables, about hydrogen, because especially green hydrogen, because here in Spain, there's a boom of projects around the country, and there's a lot of hype with the new connections with the Central Europe, new hydrogen tube with pipeline with France. So What's your view of the future of this technology?
Yeah, I think when we talk about hydrogen, it helps to back up for a moment and talk about what hydrogen is, because that helps us understand what it's good for and what it's not good for. So hydrogen is an energy carrier. It's like electricity. It's not a fuel like natural gas or oil. So you have to make hydrogen from something else. And when you talk about green hydrogen, that means using renewable electricity or zero carbon electricity to split hydrogen atom or to split water atoms, I'm sorry, to make hydrogen and oxygen. This is great, but when you describe it this way, it gives you a good idea of what hydrogen is good for and not. If you can use that renewable electricity directly for, your end use, you should, because it's going to be more efficient. But hydrogen has the advantages of it's an energy carrier that looks and acts like a fuel. It's a molecule. You can store it, you can burn it, you can transport it. And for uses that can't be easily electrified, those are really great properties. Some examples of that: industrial processes where you need really high heat. That's difficult to achieve with electricity. You really need to burn something. To decarbonize that process, that something can be hydrogen. That's really helpful. If you want to transport renewable electricity over time and space, turning it into hydrogen and perhaps even a hydrogen carrier like ammonia can be really helpful. Suddenly you can move and store that green electricity in a way that you couldn't before. Applications that need a lot of energy density, to fit a lot of energy into a small space, like long distance trucking or shipping, hydrogen or a hydrogen carrier can be really useful for that. And so I think there are some who really want to see hydrogen as like the silver bullet, or, it's the solution du jour that everyone is talking about. And it's really great for what it's good for, but it's not necessarily the fuel of the future. It's not even a fuel, but it is incredibly useful for what it's good for. And so I'm optimistic. And for a country like Spain, where you have a lot of renewable energy potential, you have a delightfully sunny country there, that could be a really good way to sort of export some of your sun in terms of hydrogen. And so we just have to think about what it is and what it's not, and what it's good for and what it's not. But I am optimistic that hydrogen has an important place in the future energy economy.
Good to hear. Yeah. So going back a little bit to the politics, Europe and the G7 have invested a lot of efforts in putting in place a strong sanction regime against Russia energy exports. And however, there are doubts about the effectiveness of these sanctions, partly because it's possible still to import energy from Russia to European soil. So how do you think about the sanctions? Are they well designed and effective? We will see this year a tightening or even an approval of secondary sanctions over Russia. What's your feeling about it?
Yeah, I'll start out by saying we're talking about oil here. On the gas side, Russia actually shut off natural gas to Europe. So when we're speaking about sanctions that the West has put onto Russia, we're primarily talking about oil. And sanctioning Russian oil is hard. The reason being that Russia is a really important oil producer and oil exporter. And so the world economy, in a sense, needs Russian oil because we don't have a quick replacement for that to keep the economy running and to keep oil prices from spiking horribly. And so what we have done in sanctioning Russian oil is something we've never done before. And it's clever and very interesting, is instead of like saying the world is not going to buy Russian oil, like we've done with, say, Iran or Venezuela, instead, what we're doing is trying to limit Russian revenue from oil. We're saying, okay, we want your oil supply, but we don't want you to make a lot of money off of it to fuel the war in Ukraine. I gotta say, it's working. It's working better than I thought it was going to. I'm very delighted to be wrong in this instance. The most recent oil markets report that came out of the International Energy Agency pointed out that Russian oil exports are actually up. They're back up to pre-war levels of about 8 million barrels per day, or roughly 8% of total global oil supply. Like, this is serious. But Russian revenue is way down 43% over a year ago. So this is exactly what the sanctions were trying to do. They were trying to keep Russian oil on the market to keep the global economy turning, while reducing the money that Russia was getting to fuel its oil machine. Russia is now selling oil to fewer customers who are more able to demand discounts. So I don't expect to see secondary sanctions. I think you might see them fiddling somewhat with the oil price cap, although the most recent decision was to keep it at $60 a barrel. But I think the system is working better than I expected, and I don't expect secondary sanctions because it's largely working.
I agree that most economists and energy experts are surprised, like the sanctions are working surprisingly well in that sense. But I wonder if part of this strategy depends on the price of oil. And if you look at the last events, especially at OPEC meetings, the recent decision to restrict output, if prices go up again a little bit, then this strategy may have some doubts. And there's increasing alignment between OPEC and some Middle East countries with Russia, putting the strategy in this organization. So how do you see these changes in terms of geopolitics? What will be the impact of these energy changes also in terms of globalization?
Yeah, it's a really terrific question. And what we're seeing happening now with the sanctions is, in a sense, we're making global oil markets less efficient. If you think about the way the market operated before all of this happened, oil generally went to the place that it made the most sense for it to go, both in terms of shipping distance and in terms of what various refineries can handle. And so, in a sense, moving Russian oil around to folks who are willing to buy it, we've made the system less efficient. Like, for instance, you might be shipping Russian crude oil to be refined in India that might have earlier been refined in Europe. Some of those fuels may actually find their way back to Europe. But again, as long as you have reduced Russian revenues, taken away some of the money for the war machine, the goal of the sanctions is still working, even if you're seeing Russian oil products even find their way into European markets. And this inefficiency is the price that we're paying to reduce Russian oil revenues. Like, we're really minimizing the effect on the oil economy, but nothing is free. And it's worth it for now. I mean, I'm really pleased at how it's working. I'm pleased to see Russian revenues go down. But this question of, will we have permanently balkanized energy markets? Like, have we forever changed the shape of who's willing to buy what? I think is a really good question. And the recent OPEC decision to lower production quotas really made me wonder that more. I mean, I, in a sense, saw that as the OPEC group siding with Russia, in a sense, trying to raise oil prices in order to make markets tighter, to perhaps increase Russian oil revenues, which is at odds with what the West is trying to do. I'm concerned about that. I'm seeing this sort of division between the West and the rest in energy markets, and I'm not sure what to think about it. And so I really think time's going to tell on that one, but I think you're really asking good questions.
I was surprised because we talk about these wedge between the North and the Global South, and normally it's in rhetorical terms, but lately there's some events, this OPEC for me was very clear that they are taking actions against the benefits or the values that we are trying to pursue, here with the energy prices direction. Also, when you talk about Lula's, the president of Brazil, present speech talking about the need to make trade in other currencies. You also had last year another conversation with China and Saudi Arabia talking about not using dollars in their trade, energy trade. So this will have an enormous impact also in the energy markets and in the trade relationship. So I don't know, what's your view about also these other aspects?
Yeah, In a way, I'm not surprised to see this discussion about moving away from the US dollar in international energy trade. And I mean, it makes some sense. The US is not the gigantic buyer on international energy markets that it used to be. And so some of this move towards local currencies just makes sense. I don't think in an overall sense that we're entirely moving away from the dollar as the currency, particularly in global oil trade, just because I don't think there's an obvious substitute for the dollar. I think a lot of people wouldn't mind that in terms of US hedge money and all that, but I don't think there's an obvious other place to go. So I don't see that happening. I see these as changes around the edges rather than a fundamental change in the middle. But I think some of the other backlash that you're seeing in the global South against what's going on right now is Europe got through the winter really well, and I'm glad. But there was a price to be paid. And that price was largely paid in the global South, where because Europe was pulling in all of the world's LNG, many countries, particularly in like Southeast and South Asia, couldn't get gas. They couldn't afford it. And so they ended up going back to coal with all the both greenhouse gas and local pollution problems that causes. And so, you know, it's good that Europe got through, but it wasn't free, and it happened at the expense of the global South. And they recognize that. And so I get the backlash. And it's something that we're going to have to think about how to deal with geopolitically and in climate negotiations, because it's real.
So try to conclude, we are ending this conversation. So I would like to actually to do kind of exercise, no? And think about what would be.
Sorry, Victor. Could you please restart the question? You're kind of touching your mic and the background noises, please. Sorry.
In order to conclude the conversation, I would like you to do an exercise thinking about what will be the case, you know, if things in Ukraine calm down and we are thinking about the rapprochement between Europe and Russia and between Germany and Russia. How do you foresee the energy relationship between them? Should we expect things going back as they were before, or it doesn't matter if things change in the ground and some of the changes we have seen will become permanent?
You know, I do not expect to see Europe and Germany in particular go back to its dependence on Russian gas. For starters, I don't see the sort of friendly ending to the war in Ukraine that you're thinking of happening. I don't see, you know, as long as Putin is in power, I don't see him backing away from the conflict and ending it in a way that makes Europe comfortable trusting him. That doesn't seem likely to me. I think it's also true that it's just we're never going to trust Gazprom and Russia again as being a reliable supplier. I mean, you saw some political cutbacks before, and you know, many in Europe shrugged it off. And I get it. The gas was cheap. The pipelines were in the ground. You know, Germans didn't want to use this gas forever. Like, it would have been a really hard decision to move away from it. So I tried to go easy on the Schadenfreude about that. But I don't see them going back. I think they've learned their lesson. I think they will never trust Gazprom again as like an ordinary commercial supplier of energy. I think that the lesson has been learned, never again. And Europe is only going forward in moving away from Russian energy and particularly Russian natural gas. This is it.
To conclude, thank you, Samantha, for your time today. It has been really a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I have learned a lot about energy, about geopolitics, and about the environment. So it has been really a pleasure. You are very welcome to come to CIDOB whenever you want and have a new conversation.